Again, my name is Nicholson. I'm one of the program staff at Headwaters, which basically means I have the beautiful job of running into amazing people and really supporting them in doing their work. And I have a special guest tonight. And Justin, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself? Sorry, can you guys hear back there? I have kind of a big voice. I don't know if I need this. Justin, why don't you talk for just a couple of minutes about yourself, and then I gave Justin these really great questions. I thought they were great. They actually, I was totally in the moment of writing these questions out. So we're actually going to follow the script, which is really unusual for me. We'll actually ask those questions. Well, we'll try to. And then we'll go off and get other people's input and thoughts around these subjects. So yeah, why don't we start there?
Great. Well, first I say, Yate Kwasine. Hello, relatives. I greet you that way because you're in the All My Relations Gallery, so you're my relatives here tonight. So, and again, on behalf of the Native American Community Development Institute, I say welcome to not only this gallery and this building, which is one of our projects, but I like to also say welcome to the American Indian Cultural Corridor on Franklin Avenue. And one of my favorite things to do is to have evening type events like this when people are walking by and driving by and they're looking in, because Franklin Avenue for a number of years, once it was 5 o'clock, it was pretty much no activity. So I'm originally from Arizona, born and raised on the Navajo Reservation, and I grew up on the res as a res kid, moved to South Dakota. My dream was to go back to Arizona, ASU. I was an ASU fan all those years, and then I found out this thing called out-of-state tuition. So I no longer could afford, my family couldn't afford to send me back to ASU. But then I heard this really cool thing called tuition reciprocity with the University of Minnesota. And so I paid South Dakota tuition to go to the University of Minnesota. And so that's pretty much how I arrived here. So I'm definitely as they would tease, a lost sheep here among the Ojibwe and the Dakota. But I have to say that I owe a lot to this community. I owe a lot to the people here around Minneapolis and just the tribes here, because I'm a guest. You're on Dakota land here, and I'm a transplant, but have been afforded a family welcome and have been here now for this will be 21 years since I've been here. So I haven't been kicked out yet.
Well, as the night goes, we'll make sure that you're not kicked out by the questions out.
Okay.
So, first of all, I look across the audience and I see that the majority of folks in the audience, I would just guess, are not Native Americans. And so for them, I thought it might be interesting just to get a little bit of a context to how you see, particularly as we're in the midst of this amazing exhibit, this idea of sovereignty and this idea of self-determination, just how you kind of come to understand it and how it's played out a little bit in your life.
Sure. Well, I won't pretend to be a historian at all, but I have become more and more very interested in history. I don't think you can talk about the history of this country or this state without understanding Indian history. And so, a lot of my talking when I speak to young people or in the community, I'm always talking about vision and the future and moving forward. But I really am careful to say that we have to do that in the context of our history. It's not about that happened then, let's just keep moving forward. So what you're sitting in here really is starting at that panel where it says why treaties matter. It's basically a timeline that wraps this way and then and goes this way. The issue of self-determination and sovereignty are probably some of the most key components to Indian country today. And yet probably in many ways some of the most complex and misunderstood, not only by non-Native people, but even by Native people. It's that complex. And the issues of treaties, which are core to the issue of sovereignty, the supreme law of the lands, these are living documents. These are not documents that sit in a museum somewhere and we sort of admire through the plexiglass. These are living documents that inform, that determine still our relationship as nations in this country with our federal government. And we had a speaker here just a number of weeks ago, Dr. David Wilkins, who's really a legal scholar, Indian legal scholar, who basically said, he challenged every Indian person, because I see a number of Indian people here, How many of you have ever read your own tribal treaty? Just like probably as U.S. citizens, how many of you have read the entire Constitution, for that matter? And I found that interesting because I've never read, and a lot of tribes have multiple treaties. I mean, and some tribes have even a dozen treaties that they signed. There were over 300 plus treaties that were signed. And some people have tried to define treaties as like agreements. But what I understood by Dr. Wilkins, they're far stronger than simply agreements. And the fact that they are the term, the supreme law of the land, they continue still to this day to be, by and large, held up by the U.S. Supreme Court and other court systems that recognize that these are living treaties. And so the idea of sovereignty, the idea of nationhood, is rolled up and bound by these treaties that still exist today. Now, the interesting thing about, even though they are perhaps some of the most important agreements, documents held, not one treaty has ever been fulfilled by the U.S. government. Every single treaty has been broken, not by the Indian side, but by the U.S. government. And the last treaty was signed, as I understand it, treaty making in 1871. But most of the treaties were signed between 1800 and 1860. Now you got to remember the Louisiana Purchase was 1803, and the Termination Act by Andrew Jackson was 1831. I mean, so if you look at all the treaties, that were all designed by and large to get land. And I would add just like this one last piece, the issue of sovereignty. If you remember, President Bush stumbled on the question of what is sovereignty, and the idea that, well, sovereignty was given, and you often hear people talk about treaties as if, we were given land or we were given certain rights. And that is a complete fallacy, misunderstood by most folks who live in this country. Treaties, the federal government didn't give anything to Indian people. They didn't give us extra rights. Treaties were really negotiations where tribal nations reserved certain rights. They held certain rights. And so the idea of sovereignty is the ability, the opportunity to be sovereign over your own land, your own people, to create your own rules. And so the idea that somehow the federal government gave us sovereignty, it completely misunderstands the issue of sovereignty. And so that's one big thing, is that treaties didn't give us anything. It reserved the right to fish, to hunt, to certain land base. And so in those negotiations, the leadership were really reserving certain rights.
Thank you. It's interesting, as I'm sitting around here looking at these displays, I happen to be looking right at this one where there's these, amazing leaders at their time who, as you said, let me back up for a second. One of the things that we try and do with these movement building series is to try and connect to the historical moment that we're in now. We're in a historical moment in society, and I'm kind of drawn so much to these pictures over here because they were at a historical moment in time. In that historic moment in time, they had the opportunity and the responsibility for their people to, just as you said, to negotiate and reserve some things for the future, for us that are here. And, it makes me also think about, as we move further down here, you mentioned in passing, and maybe I want you to talk about it for a minute, but the Relocation Act in the 1950s, because not only are we surrounded by the treaties here, but we're also surrounded by Franklin Avenue, which was a major center for American Indians moving from various reservations here, and what that has brought up, and what that has meant to the Twin Cities here. So maybe you want to take a minute to jump on those. How's that?
Well, first let me, so I learned about this photo here, that this particular photo was a group of Sissetawan and Wapaitawan Dakotas that were brought to Washington, D.C. There was a delegation, and the delegation, you can imagine one just traveling from Minneapolis or Minnesota, to Washington, D.C. in 1858. I mean, it wasn't a 4-hour plane ride or whatever. So one, they went to D.C., and then they were basically held in D.C. for over 3 months and paraded around D.C. to parties and all of these events and made to wear funny top hats and take lots of photos. And the story goes, as I understand it, was they were so sick of D.C. They wanted to come back home bad. Imagine being paraded around, the language issues, and they were basically a novelty item in many ways. And they eventually just wanted to get home. So as I understand it in some ways, and you see right there, this was the group that in essence signed the allotment of 24 million acres of land to the United States. As I understand it, again, this is just one of the stories told, was they were ready to sign anything just to get home. They were seriously sick of being there and didn't know if they were ever going to get home. They were just sort of stuck there in many ways. And so it's always interesting because I think as we look at these photos, people probably think, oh, look at these Indians just decided to put on top hats and just take a photo. But if you look at them, none of them look too happy wearing this top hat. I mean, there's a lot of this novelty stuff. So anyway, I think that's kind of an interesting photo of the delegation that went and eventually why they signed. Because at the time, you got to remember, there was a lot of provisions that were being held from their people. I mean, and so some of these are so complex in terms of why would Indians sign certain things. I mean, you got to remember that, hard winters, you had the Indian agents out here that were supposedly supposed to take care of through certain provisions, hence why the whole uprising. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to that, but again, they did their best, but imagine being in a place you've never been for a long time and basically saying, well, all you have to do is sign right here and we'll get you home, kind of thing. So when I think about where we're at today in terms of, both the United States, but also here in Minnesota, I think it's really important, and I've been sharing this more and more with my kids. If you think sort of initial or pre-contact, some would estimate that the population of the indigenous community here, just in the United States, not including Canada, not including our brothers and sisters to the south, very conservative estimates put it at 10 million. I've seen estimates at 25 to 50 million indigenous people. Now, I tend to use more of a conservative number, so let's just say 10 million people. By the early 1900s, 1917, right around there was about 250,000 Native people left. That's a 99% reduction in what was only about 250 years. And when you look at the whole issue of allotment, when you had literally hundreds of millions of acres at one point under tribal jurisdiction, even around some of the original treaties. And by 1934, tribal jurisdiction only had about 40 million acres left collectively in all of Indian country. It's astonishing, and so you can see the huge population decline, the huge land decline, and so I don't know. Recently, I just caught this thing that I don't know how many know John Stossel. John Stossel made this comment that basically Native Americans are probably that the federal government has done more for Native people than any other group, and it's about time to stop, kind of thing. Like we've been so taken care of, but you hear this because you think of now these treaties. And so many folks say, well, don't they already have all this gaming and they have all this, when do we stop taking care of these Indians? But when you think of it in terms of a genocidal act, that 99% of the population was wiped off the face of this country, and the hundreds of millions of acres that I wrote down something because I'll bring it a little more local. White Earth went from 800,000 acres of tribal land. And during the allotment process, the Dawes Act, by 1934, White Earth tribal land equaled 810 acres. So that was about a 99% loss. And today, they now are under their jurisdiction 80,000 acres. They literally have purchased back again about 75 to 80,000 of their own acreage through a revolving loan fund by the U.S. government. And that's a very common. You think, 99% loss, but that's a very common number. The Nez Perce. I can go down the list of so many tribes that have lost the majority of their land and now are slowly purchasing it back with their own dollars. So anyway, the whole Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, is another huge one. But so then you start looking at all these things, the termination era, etc. And then you get up to about the 1950s. And one of the things that caught my attention at that time was this by Vine Deloria Jr., who was, again, a very known Native scholar. And he made the statement that by the 1950s, Indian people, Indian country as a whole, had hit rock bottom. And I'm like, wow, to say, and this is, so my parents were both alive at this time. I'm thinking, this is not that long ago, 1950s, the middle of the 1950s, to say Indian country had hit rock bottom. So what does rock bottom mean? Well, the average life expectancy of an Indian person was 42 years of age. 42 years of age. I'm 38. I'd be, at that time, it'd be like thinking that I'm only 4 years away from that life expectancy. Infant mortality claims 62% of all 1,000 live births. In my reservation back home, you had in the K-12 school enrollment, over 60% of all children, all school-age children, were not enrolled in any type of educational system. And if they were primarily in a BIA or boarding school environment. So imagine over 60% of your kids, K through 12, being not enrolled in any sort of system of education. At that time, only 5% of all American Indian adults had a high school diploma. This is 1950s. This isn't 1800 or early 1900s. This is, 62 years ago. And as you know, many of the tribal reservations at that time had easily unemployment rates of 60, 70, and around here, South Dakota, parts of Minnesota had 80, 90% unemployment. Very common. We're hitting 11, 12 in Detroit. It's a mess. But imagine 80, 90% of your entire community, no employment. And so you could count in 1950s the amount of Indian lawyers on one hand in the entire United States. You could count the amount of American Indian physicians in the entire United States on one hand. Now, why do I share all that with you? It's a dismal story. But what's amazing is that it's taken us only 62 years. There's an entire associations of American Indian physicians, entire legal system of American, So that's the amazing story here, and we can get to that. But I think it's important to lay that foundation and to see that while there were calculated policies to literally get rid of Indian people, and by and large it really did a toll, that to think about the fact in 1 and 2 generations how far Indian people have come. We're just at the beginning of this, what I call a reclamation or a return. So anyway, I can ramble on, but
no. It's actually really interesting for me on a number of levels. One, as I said, for me to be surrounded by so much history, and then to be surrounded even by Franklin Avenue, which has its own history. Again, shortly after that, as Vine DeLorean said, kind of a low point for health, wealth, and opportunities for folks. Really in areas like this, with the AIM movement, with the Indian Center, and some courageous work with leaders here to ensure that Native people in the urban area had a sense of community, had a sense of place. And so I wanted just to kind of move us through the history a little bit, but mention that for a minute, and then also mention where we're at now from your perspective, and what does prosperity look like going forward? Because we have some young people in here whose reality it will be to move this forward.
Right. So we'll pick up from the 1950s, I guess. So basically from 1953 to 1964, that's the period folks call the termination era. And there were a number of policies that were created in that vein to terminate the idea of tribalhood. to basically say that we no longer, as a federal government, recognize tribes. It was a complete attack on sovereignty. And so we have some historic cases and efforts where there was, for example, the Menominee Nation at one point was wiped off the idea of tribal nationhood. It was no longer a tribe. I mean, there's some amazing stories, Ada Deer and others who who battled back and basically fought for this idea of their nation, and it came back. But there was, again, about 11 years of some very interesting calculated policies of termination. And one of them was this 1956 Relocation Act, which some of you maybe have heard me talk about. This was a federal act that, again, they were trying to get folks away from their tribal roots and their tribal lands. So what it basically promised was vocational training. They would pay for you to move off your reservation into urban cities. There were designated cities like Chicago and LA and Seattle and New York and some of these larger centers. Minneapolis was not originally an original urban relocation center until a second phase, like Phoenix, and then we were added in Denver and some of those. But you can imagine, again, you put it up against, you're sitting in South Dakota on a reservation experiencing 80-90% unemployment, and then the federal government says, hey, I'll pay you to move away from there to Minneapolis, and I'll promise you vocational training and a job and a place to live. You saw over 75,000 Indian people get up and leave their tribal communities and flood these urban centers. But again, what they arrived to was a complete unfulfilled promise. None of it was ever in place, none of the infrastructure, and so what you had was very poor Indian people, often uneducated Indian people, leaving poor reservation communities, coming into Minneapolis or Chicago. Where do they go? Where do they end up? Well, they do what all Indians do in those situations. I'll just find some more and let's hang out. They started to gather and hang out, and the story goes for me, as it was told to me, the first program here in Minneapolis, sort of in the spirit of program, was a group of elder women who got together and sewed blankets, quilts. And the idea was, as a new family arrived, these ladies would gift this family because it was cold. I mean, you can imagine winters, and so slowly through that time, and then you started having, again, out of a response of some of the activity, like police issues, crime and safety, no job activity. I mean, Indians were pissed. Indians were really pissed off. And so you can imagine how the American Indian movement started. I mean, it started right across the street at this corner. There was a building. And the American Indian movement really was, in many ways, a movement of being fed up. Enough is enough. We are no longer going to just allow the government and others just to sort of roll over us. But in fact, we are going to stand on our own and determine our own future. And from there came a lot of effort. Now, American Indian movement gets a lot of credit for a lot of things, and deservedly so, from the standpoint of making some noise and really getting some things in the forefront. But when you look at like the Self-Determination Act, you look at the Indian Education Act, if you look at the Indian Religious Freedom Act, and you look at some of these major federal policies that happened in primarily the 70s, it was groups, Indian folks, who, once all the noise was made, had to stay and do the work. And so I think some of those voices often get lost.